Hey guys, what is going on? So I just wanted to go over my training philosophies, how I currently train, and everything that is kind of in my current program, even though I don't actually run a program. So as I've been hitting a lot of PRs recently, I get a lot of questions about how I train. How am I hitting all these maxes every day? Not just in terms of how I'm making the progress, but how do I structure that into my actual training? And I kind of wanted to give some insight on that, as well as just my overall kind of training style and how I implement all these things over the past couple years, and just kind of the philosophies behind that. So to sum it up, it is largely under the umbrella of Nucleus overload training, which is a term that was coined by Megan from Team 3D Alpha. And I actually have bought Megan's program, even though I don't actually run it myself. I take a lot of the knowledge that's in that book, in that program, and apply it to my training. So again, I don't actually run the program, but a lot of it is incorporated into my training, and I believe in supporting the creators that you learn from. And so I just bought the program with no actual intention of running it. No, I'm not against programs by any means, and I think people that are looking for structure in their training is probably a very good idea to run a program. And it's probably the most consistent thing that actually works, but I just don't have the commitment or the dedication to do something like that when my training has always been very kind of auto-regulated, and I always am listening to my body, adjusting things on the fly, and that just doesn't mix with the very structured program. So my training style is not something that I necessarily recommend. It's not something that I'm going to write programs about. I have no intention of selling anything to you. I'm just kind of going over some of the things that I do for those that are curious, or maybe if you want to apply some of these principles from my training and or just Nucleus overload in general, this could maybe be a place to start. So in terms of Megan's program and how I currently do things, there's kind of three major pillars of Nucleus overload training, or the HSP training, that Megan actually has in his program. So HSP stands for heavy, stretch, and pump. And these are kind of things that I have done independently. And I've focused a lot of my training on pump training in the last couple years. But as of recent, I've actually been emphasizing the stretch portion of this, and I've started to see some pretty good results. That being said, the heavy portion of this training style is something that I've hammered home pretty consistently throughout my training. I was always a believer in just, progressive overload is everything, and that's all that matters. And as I've gotten older and in recent years, I've started to implement different things, and that's really where my gains started to accelerate as somebody who's a bit more advanced. I do want to be clear though, the vast majority of the muscle that I've gained in my life was just simply due to standard progressive overload, regular compound lifts, and a lot of the recent muscle that I've gained has been incorporating these other strategies once I've kind of, I haven't exhausted all the results I can get from heavy compounds, but that is what built my base, and I want to emphasize that. So in HSP training, heavy training is only one portion of it, and now I treat it much more so as just one component of my training, and that's when things really started to take off. My understanding of Nucleus overload in the past and how I have implemented it into my training over the last couple years has largely just been focusing on pump training, but I've kind of neglected the stretch portion of this until pretty recently. The stretch portion of training is like the bottom of the movement. So for example, if you're doing a dumbbell fly, it would be the bottom is where you really want to emphasize it. Or for example, if you're doing shrugs, it's not the actual shrugging movement, but the actual weighted stretch at the bottom that you're focusing on. Another example could be RDLs, right? As opposed to focusing on the concentric portion of the RDL, you're really trying to get that weighted stretch instead. And that's where you're getting some possible muscle growth or hyperplasia via that stretch component. Now, again, I can't do any justice to Nucleus overload training in terms of describing it. If you want more information, Megan from Team 3D Alpha is where you want to go. Or if you want to actually utilize that program, it is in a very concise program that I would recommend, even though I don't currently use it. I think there's a lot of good information in there. But basically what had me wanting to start implementing the stretch aspect of training and kind of treat it equally among the other aspects like heavy training and pump training was running Triphasic Training, which is something that Cal Dietz has basically perfected at this point. Triphasic training is actually acknowledging that there are different aspects of a lift, and you can actually train those individually and get better results splitting them up into different phases. For example, before I hit my 405 bench press, I implemented a triphasic kind of peaking program, and although I didn't actually follow it in the exact steps, that's probably the closest thing to a program that I've ran in quite some time. The philosophy behind this is that you do one phase of eccentric loading where you focus on the eccentric aspect of any given lift, and you do that for 2 to 3 weeks, followed by a 2 to 3 week period of isometric training, followed by your standard concentric training, which is what most people kind of focus on. The reason I started triphasic in the first place was because I was able to hit a lot of volume PRs, but once I started implementing very heavy weights in my bench press, once I started to go, using 385, 395, I noticed that my ability to actually lower the weight in a controlled fashion, absorb the force, everything like that, wasn't where it really should be. You may have the concentric strength to lift a weight, but if you can't handle the force and then reapply it in an efficient manner, you're not going to be able to utilize your strength potential. Shortly after starting my eccentric phase in triphasic, I noticed that my ability to actually control heavy weights went up significantly. This is obviously followed by an isometric phase, and this taught me how to actually reapply that force after being able to control it, which is something that I really struggled with before. After doing this, you just go back to what is considered regular training, which is just focusing on the concentric portion of the movement. And I noticed that shortly after trying this, I just started hitting PRs left and right, and I eventually hit a 405 bench PR. Now, after implementing this peaking program, I continued to take those strategies as I noticed that some of my other lifts went up without me even really doing them. The way that I structured my triphasic program was just splitting it into a push day and a pull day, and I noticed that a lot of my rowing movements went up significantly over this time period, even when it wasn't really a focus of mine. I also implemented some of these eccentric and isometric portions into just, leg press or anything involving legs, which was absolutely not my focus at all. And I noticed that my strength in my legs shot up significantly, even if it's not really an emphasis of my training. At this point, I don't actually split up my training into specific 2-3 week blocks of doing only eccentric, only isometric. I run them all simultaneously while also running HSP simultaneously. So doing heavy movements, stretch movements, and pump movements. One of the other major aspects of nucleus overload training is implementing full body workouts. And that's something that I've been doing for quite some time. And this is usually how I structure my training. I'm not against split training, and in fact, when I did my triphasic peaking program, I split it up into a push day and then a pull day. This is not currently how I train. So basically, to sum up everything that I do, I basically run nucleus overload training, which is implementing full body workouts. I do them as often as I can, and I do each component, heavy, stretch, pump, all within the same workout, as well as I try and implement different aspects of triphasic training into my workout as well. Now, in terms of how I actually structure each individual training session, a lot of it is just done on the fly. But again, this is after having a lot of experience lifting and understanding my body. So I've always been a big believer in emphasizing what you want to accomplish the most at the start of your workout. And I think it makes sense to be very fresh for your strength movements. And therefore, the heavy aspect of my training is done at the very beginning. Some of you guys may look at my PR streak that I went on pretty recently and wonder how I was able to PR so consistently and how I actually was able to recover from that. So one thing that I want to emphasize is that my ability to recover is quite high after doing nucleus overload training for years at this point, as well as being a former athlete who often did 2-a-day workouts in high school. I just overall have a much better ability to recover. How much of this is actually genetics versus just training in that style and doing high volume training, I don't know. But what I can say is that it's not necessarily something that other people can recover from. And so again, I'm not recommending this, but I'm just saying all the aspects of my training that I do. So usually when I walk into the gym, I want to focus on the heavy aspects of my lift first, and then I can move on to the other aspects as I go along. So for example, if you see me hit a bench PR, doing any given rep range, that's going to be the first movement that I do. And I will basically go for a PR, try and push myself in whatever rep range I feel I want to go for at that given time. And then I don't really do anything else associated with that type of rep range. I don't do back off sets or anything like that. I move on to something else. So for example, if I hit a PR on bench press in any given rep range, I'm not going to then immediately go into standard bench press training, as I've already kind of exhausted those muscles in that plane of motion. Then I'll move on to something like the overhead press, and I will do some kind of volume work with something like that, maybe, sets of 3, sets of 5, whatever it ends up being. And I will do some sets there and then move on to the stretch aspect of my training. Now, I don't always start with bench press. I might start with overhead press, and then if I do my one set of overhead press, then I can move on to doing volume work with bench press. It's just a constantly changing thing depending on what I'm going for at the beginning of the workout. So you might see me hit 315 for a set of 13, and then the next day I wouldn't try and do another bench press max out. I'd try and do, for example, an overhead press max out. And then if I were to come back the following day, I'm not going to go and try and hit a PR with 315. I might bump up the weights and go for a 335 AMREP, and I'll just keep trying to find new rep ranges that I can PR in. I don't actually plan to ascend these, but an example would be if I hit a 315 AMREP one day, the next time I bench, I might come back and try 335, and then I might try 355, and I can just continue to work in different rep ranges and try and go for a PR. And basically my philosophy here is that there is one rep range that I can probably squeak out another rep on, or maybe there's some type of volume PR spreading across in terms of doing 3 sets of 3 on something that I've never done before. But I basically try and hit a PR at the beginning of my workout, whatever it ends up being. Obviously, I don't get one every single day, but if you're constantly working your strength in different rep ranges and you take a while to come back to a different weight, usually if you're progressing, you're able to hit a PR again and again if you're on that streak and you have that mindset. So for me, every time I walk into the gym, I actually expect to hit a PR. And if I go in thinking I'm not going to hit it, I'm not going to hit it. But if I PR on a 315 AMRAP, it might be weeks until I try that same rep range again or that same weight. And usually I can squeak out another rep within that time, assuming I'm progressing on these lifts, recovering properly, etc. So once I emphasize that strength or that heavy portion of the lift, I move on to the stretch aspect. So my stretch training is actually kind of combining the first 2 phases of triphasic and implementing the weighted stretch as being a way to grow muscle as well. One thing that I've been a fan of as of recent is doing 6-second eccentric lifts where I lower the weight for 6 seconds, and then I can choose to do one of 2 things. To further reinforce the pattern of exploding at the bottom and utilizing your stretch reflex, sometimes at the end of the 6 seconds, I will immediately explode with no pause, with no emphasis on stretch, and I will just explode up, and that'll be one aspect. Other times I might pause at the bottom of the movement, try and get the maximum weighted stretch, and then I explode up. In terms of the concentric portion of my lift, I always explode with maximum velocity, but my eccentrics are very often used in a different tempo, like a 3-second eccentric or a 6-second eccentric. And then, like I said, I may or may not pause at the bottom and get that maximum weighted stretch. Then I can do other exercises where I don't necessarily focus on getting the longest eccentric portion possible, but I try and pause at the bottom for as long as I can and then explode at the top as I usually would. As of recent, I've been emphasizing my triceps a lot, so I do a lot of exercises where I focus on stretching the long head of the tricep, getting a lot of range of motion, and really emphasizing that weighted stretch to be able to hit that long head in an angle that I really wasn't hitting all that much in the past. This emphasis on stretch training is very high for me because it's an area that I've neglected for years, and so I do almost all of my bodybuilding work like this. However, I still see the value of pump training, and while that's been an emphasis of my training over the past couple of years, I continue to implement it as well. So usually towards the end of my workouts, it doesn't really matter how tired I am. That's when I would implement pump training, and this probably takes up the smallest portion of my lifts as of recent. Pump training is basically working in high rep ranges, trying to get the best contraction possible and not focusing on the eccentric or the weighted stretch or anything like that, but focusing on the shortening of the muscle and the actual contraction and just trying to get as much blood flow as possible. There's really not too much to this, and this is how a lot of bodybuilders train already. and there's a lot of emphasis on the concentric portion of the movement. So there's not really a lot to learn here other than just doing a lot of volume at very high rep ranges with relatively low weight. I don't think this is the least important aspect of training, but considering I've emphasized it quite a bit in the past couple of years, but I haven't emphasized the stretch training, I spend a lot less time doing this than I do with my other lifts. Another thing is when I'm doing strength training, I do a lot of rest in between sets to stay fresh, whereas with pump training, I almost always implement drop sets, and these drop sets usually take a very short period of time. In terms of how I implement push training, pull training, legs within my workout, I usually do it in that order as I'm most focused on push workouts just in terms of wanting to up my strength. Then I'll move on to back, and then legs unfortunately get the least amount of work just because it's not something that I'm emphasizing all that much. Now, some people believe that doing legs before can be beneficial. I think Megan believes this as well, but I've always been a believer that you should actually emphasize the lifts that you want to go up the most or that you want to grow the most first, and so this is how I structure my training. As far as frequency, I train pretty much every day, and it's not uncommon for me to get 2 lifts during a day as well. It's not that I don't take rest days, I just do not plan for them. I understand that this is too much volume for the vast majority of people, and I often spend multiple hours in the gym on a daily basis, but this is just ultimately how I like to train, and I've been getting really good results doing it, so I will continue. So if you guys have any questions about anything in particular that I covered here, this is obviously just kind of an overarching theme of what I do, but I will start to show my actual training footage here shortly and kind of go over every little thing that I do, and hopefully I can answer some questions throughout all of this. Anyway, that's all I got to say about that. I'll keep you updated, and I'll talk to you soon.